Actually, all right, hello everyone. We are here for another exciting Awesome Ocean Live. It is brought to you by AwesomeOcean.com. I'm your host, Eric, the editor-in-chief of Awesome Ocean, and then we have Erin here, our co-host.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again.
And so we are thrilled. We have a very special Awesome Ocean Live today, and our special guest today is Dr. Gray Stafford. He's the Director of Conservation for the Wildlife World Zoo, Aquarium, and Safari Park located outside Phoenix, Arizona. This Q&A is being hosted by AwesomeOcean.com, a website that celebrates the conservation and our oceans and the hardworking people who are on the front lines of conservation, research animal care at zoos and aquariums and marine parks. And then, Erin, why don't you go ahead and share our rules for today?
Okay, everyone. So, as you know, if you've been here before, we encourage involvement. So, we're going to ask you just to throw up your questions, and we are going to see them all. We're going to read them all, and we'll get to them at the end of whatever topic we're discussing. But if you post negative, bullying, or slanderous comments, they will not be tolerated. We will delete them, and anyone who posts them will be banned, and you can bet on that. We'll do it.
Yes.
But we also want you definitely to have fun. We want this to be a great interactive experience for everybody, and we also want you to tweet about this, join the conversation, use the hashtag AOAwesomeOcean. That's Awesome Ocean, AO Live, and feel free to tweet at OneAwesomeOcean and Dr. Stafford's Twitter handle, which is at ZooMility, during the Q&A. So come and join the conversation either on Twitter or here, and we will have a great conversation here tonight.
And before we get going, we're going to give you a brief bio on our amazing, awesome guest. Dr. Gray Stafford is the author of an amazing animal training book called Zoomility, Keeper Tales of Training with Positive Reinforcement. I know Erin has read this book. He began his career as a former SeaWorld Ohio trainer of marine mammals, including orcas. For the past 25 years, he has studied, presented, cared for, and managed hundreds of terrestrial and aquatic species. As the Director of Conservation for the Wildlife Zoo, Aquarium, and Safari Park, he actively promotes wildlife and habitat preservation and positive reinforcement-based training for all species through weekly televised segments in Arizona. He is a member of IMATA, ZAA, and AZA, and serves on the editorial advisory boards for the International Marine Animal Trainers Association and the European Association of Aquatic Mammals. All right, so with all of that, welcome to the show, Dr. Stafford. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me here.
Well, we are absolutely thrilled to have you. You have a long list of accomplishments. You've been on numerous television shows, and you made a lot of TV appearances. So we first want to welcome you, and we want to kind of find out why did you decide to work with animals? And let's start from there as we dive into some of these really big issues that we're dealing with today.
Sure thing. Well, I didn't start out planning on working with animals when I was in high school or college. I actually was a physics major in college, and a couple of years after graduating from college, my wife-to-be at that point in time, Karen, and I went to SeaWorld of Ohio as visitors, and I had been there several times growing up in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio. And what I saw was amazing. I saw a single trainer out there doing what was called a water ballet with a bottlenose dolphin and a killer whale. And here you had three predator species all interacting with each other, working together in this massive pool. And I was, as Karen retells it, my jaw was on the ground the entire time, just stunned. And so I did what probably millions of kids have done over the years. I went up afterwards and talked to the trainer, and I said, hey, what does it take to become a trainer? And I actually got some great advice from the guy who became my boss 6 months later, and it really, that one day at SeaWorld changed my life.
That's incredible to hear, and I know a lot of people's lives are changed when they visit parks like SeaWorld and other zoological facilities, and so a lot has changed obviously since your first visit to SeaWorld as a kid and since you were first inspired. And anyone who's been paying attention to Awesome Ocean is aware, that there is a controversy, let me put it like that, of people who believe that zoos might not have a role today and in the future. And so, I'm kind of curious from your point of view, what do you think the purpose is of a modern zoo and aquarium?
Well, I absolutely disagree with those folks. I think zoos and aquariums are more important today than perhaps any other time in human history, because the role of zoos is evolving, it's changing. it certainly has and will continue to have that public display component where you have people coming in and visiting individual animals as part of a collection of in our case, at our zoo, we have over 600 species. But in the past 20 years or so, maybe 30 years, zoos have been tasked with doing something much more than that, and that is to safeguard, to study, to, in some cases, preserve wild habitat and wild populations in addition to the populations that live in zoos around the world. And this is a very challenging thing to do. It's something that a lot of great professionals, scientists, nutritionists, behaviorists, keepers, trainers, businessmen and women, marketers, and so forth are all working trying to get a handle on what's going on. And it's challenging because in the past 30 years, of course, we've added about 1 billion or so more people, maybe 2 billion more consumers to the planet, even as we're trying to study and understand our world around us. So I think zoos have an incredibly important role, that traditional role of inspiring young people like I was inspired, but also in preserving what's left of our planet.
I couldn't agree more. Wow. No, that's a lot to really kind of take in. You know, I think in one of the articles that you wrote for Awesome Ocean, you wrote how there is no wildlife. There's just kind of patches of undisturbed areas. And so, you know, when people talk about, you know, zoos and stuff like that, you know, people might hear a lot about sanctuaries. And so, what are the differences between maybe like a sanctuary and a zoo, from your point of view?
Well, other than perhaps a romanticized name, there's quite a few differences. Sanctuaries typically do not actively try to breed their animals. They provide good homes through the end of that animal's life, whatever its early existence might have been. There's no intent to breed those animals. Whereas zoos, modern zoos, are trying to propagate species sustainably and responsibly, because there is still that Noah's Ark thought where we have to provide, in many cases, a repository of that genetic material, whether it's you know, eggs or actual creatures, because they're extinct in the wild or they're almost extinct in the wild. And there are plenty of examples where zoos have contributed to preserving species. Right here in Phoenix, Arizona, our friends down the road at the Phoenix Zoo are credited largely with preserving the Arabian oryx. Some 45 or so years ago, they got the remaining handful of animals, brought them to Phoenix because we've got the great habitat for them, and began breeding them. Today, there's something, I think, around, I don't know, 600 or so in zoos around North America and around the world, in large part because of the work of one zoo and fellow zoos after that. Wow. The challenge, of course, is the success that we had with something like the Arabian oryx pales in comparison to the number of species that are on the brink of extinction or that are passing quietly into extinction because we haven't even discovered them yet.
Wow, that's a very powerful sort of way of looking at the roles of zoos, that, you know, it's this, that not only are these Noah's Ark sort of institutions, but they're also doing all this science and all of this, you know, really groundbreaking research to discover these species. So not only are they helping to protect these species that, you know, we already have, they're discovering these new species and helping to protect them as well. So, but I hear a lot of people say sometimes that, you know, zoos don't do conservation because they aren't releasing like a steady stream of animals into the wild. So what do you say to those people?
Well, I would say to those folks, look out the window. Where are you going to put them? The world is aflame in many parts of the world. A lot of the habitat is degraded and fragmented, as you said earlier, or it's gone completely. It won't sustain the original species. Or there have been species have invaded that habitat, which make it impossible for the native species to survive there. So we have a lot of serious problems, and one of the challenges in science is, of course, you want to establish a baseline before you go monkeying around and making changes to it or asking experimental questions. Well, we don't have that luxury because the baseline is changing. With every passing year, we're losing rainforests, we're changing the chemistry of the oceans, we're melting glaciers, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to understand the complexity, understand what's happening to it as this moving target evolves into the future because of largely because of human activity. So what frustrates me, and I know it frustrates a lot of my colleagues, is at a time when the need is great and the challenges are great, and some of the questions, we don't even know how to ask some of the questions. We're being hampered by lawsuits and by media campaigns and legal campaigns and hate speech, which diverts attention and, more importantly, diverts money, precious money resources away from what zoos try to do well, which is improve welfare, study animals, and in some cases reintroduce them. And it is happening on a limited basis. There are species that are being reintroduced to this day. California condor. California condor would not exist in the wild without the work of the LA Zoo, for example, as well as some state agencies and the federal government as well. But a lot of that work is paid for by the patrons and the citizens of LA County who support their zoo and support the staff there that goes out there and rescues and rehabilitates and reintroduces California condors to the wild, as an example.
So, okay, so we actually have a question that kind of falls in line. Jacqueline Mancini asks, education, preservation, and housing endangered animals is all great, but shouldn't there also be increased efforts of conservation of what's left of existing habitats?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Great question and great point. The problem is that conservation costs money because it takes money to either buy up that habitat or to train people to use it more sustainably. You know, and you know, we're always looking at Africa and Asia and you know, other areas of, boy, why don't they save that rainforest? Well, let's look at North America. We haven't done all that great a job conserving some of our species here in North America, and we have more expertise and more wealth than just about any other nation on the planet. So I think before we look down our nose at other nations who are struggling to create this balance between creating opportunity for human beings to rise up out of poverty, to educate their children, to feed and clothe their children, and at the same time not destroy their own environments, you know, we ought to also look at our own history, which is, there are some successes, but there certainly are some notable challenges that we're still dealing with. We're still discussing how many wolves belong in Yellowstone. How many bear can North America handle? Why is there a bear in my condo in the mountains? I mean, these are very real problems right here in the richest nation in the world. So imagine the kind of challenges that exist in countries where people aren't worried about preserving elephants for the next 50 years. They're worrying about feeding their kids tonight.
Certainly. Yeah, no, you bring up very real points. I think, you know, a lot of times it's easy for us to go shop at Whole Foods and, you know, really, you know, like think that we have all the world problems solved, you know, but, you know, when your next meal, you know, for your family is dependent on you being able to go out to the river and fish, you know, you might not care too much about endangered fish species or even river dolphins or the vita, for instance, you know, and I think you bring up some valid points, you know, and so one thing that actually Mary asked from DRC is, can you speak to the educational value of maintaining a live animal collection versus, say, having kids learning only from animatronics or videos?
Well, obviously, technology is very different from what it was when I was a kid, and you know, HD videos and music and GoPro cameras and internet and all that is a very powerful way to reach people. But I have, in 25 years, I've seen nothing that will compare with having a little bird land on a child's hand and eat apple slices for the first time. You know, we have, I just read a statistic today that I think in the next 30 years, some 10% of the human population will live in 41 mega urban areas. We're becoming an urbanized society. We're removed from nature, and that includes pet ownership and just seeing a bird in a park nearby. So I think the less that children today have those opportunities to turn over a rock and try to catch a crayfish out of a river, like I used to do in Ohio, you know, the less that we have those opportunities, the more important it is that we create them in situations like modern zoos and aquariums where you can touch and experience these animals in a way that no video, no game, no robotic dinosaur can match. And you have to see it every day like I do and witness the awe that it's Otherwise we're just a natural human history museum, and there's
Certainly.
nothing wrong with a natural history museum. But the one unique feature that all zoos and aquariums have that all other family attractions wish they had, in terms of being how compelling they are, is live animals. And I don't think anything can replace that.
No, I agree.
We agree 100% there.
Okay, so now we want to, we already brought up education a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about, the educational values of zoological facilities. What do you think some of the real values are of beyond just a connection? What do you feel like the real educational value is of a zoological facility?
Well, in some communities, visiting the zoo or having a mobile zoo visit their school, like an outreach like we do in our facility, in our community, that may be the only real biological unit that classroom gets because of budget cuts and so forth. So in a very real sense, I think zoos that are really plugged into their communities and their public education organizations really add value that increasingly is harder to find because schools are under pressure to cut costs and to cut some of those luxury items, if you will. And so I do think there's value there.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that is important is, of course, a lot of zoos do on-site classwork. Our mission doesn't stop at the gates. That's why we have, vehicles that can take outreach animals around the valley, schools and churches and day camps and so forth. Or, Arizona is a very large state. Most of the people are concentrated here in Phoenix and Tucson. But we have a community throughout, thousands of square miles that may never get to a zoo or certainly never get to the ocean. And so by providing an affordable way for them to get here and experience wildlife and hopefully instill some of that curiosity and desire to protect animals, we think that's part of that education mission.
So, sorry, go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of times when we're talking about education, in talking about the zoo world, the sort of education and the inspiration components that we've discussed kind of go together, right? So just because you might not walk out of a zoo knowing, the precise range of weights of an adult male sea lion doesn't mean you didn't learn anything. So, I have some experience at a zoo, like teaching kids. So, what do you think is the most important thing that somebody can take away from a visit to a zoo or an aquarium or any facility like that?
I think it is much less an intellectual message or gift, if you will, as it is one right here in the heart, and that is animals matter, habitat matters. What goes on with this creature that I see in front of me ultimately will impact my life, my children's life, and so forth. Because as nature goes, so do the human beings. So to me, it's creating that appreciation and the desire to learn more, to go and find out what the weight range is of a male California sea lion. Yeah. And one last thing about education. I have a friend that many of your listeners and people know quite well. His name is Jack Hanna, and I think the absolute world of Jack. And he had some really good advice for all of us in the zoo world many years ago at an AZA conference that his zoo hosted at the time. And he basically said, don't take the fun out of zoos. And this is something that I think that we have done as a community, is we've downplayed the role of fun in going to the zoo. Well, the fact of the matter is, going to the zoo is fun. Yeah. And learning can be fun. And it's not a four-letter word, literally and figuratively speaking, to have some fun, because when people are having fun, they're engaged, they're paying attention, and they're picking up those tidbits, those facts, and they're learning to appreciate wildlife. And I think if we zoo folks have done anything incorrectly, and there have been many things we've done incorrectly over the last 15, 20 years, it's downplaying the role of fun. Yes, education is important. Yes, conservation is important. But you know what? Go out there and have some dang fun. That's important too.
So what would
that
maybe
that teaches people care.
So what would maybe be a message that you'd want to share to any zoo detractor who might underestimate or who might understate basically the value of conservation and education values that zoos and facilities have like that?
Well, again, I point to at least a half dozen species that I can think off the top of my head that still exist today because of zoos. The scimitar horned oryx, the Arabian oryx, the black-footed ferret, the California condor. The list goes on. And what cracks me up, I mean, you know, I hear a lot from activists and extremists and the anti-zoo folks about, well, zoos haven't solved the world's problems. Really? You're right, we haven't. You haven't. And so, you know, there's a very prominent orcabiologist who said in a recent interview this last year, said, well, you know, things are pretty crappy out in the ocean, and zoos aren't obviously doing anything. And I'm like, okay, so we've added a few billion people since this new mission that zoos have taken on in the last 25, 30 years. Mm-hmm. We're eating up all the fish, all the natural resources we can, and it's zoos' fault that we haven't saved more species. Oh, and by the way, let's close all the zoos. I just don't follow the logic at all.
No, I think that's one of our biggest frustrations.
And that kind of leads into the next thing I want to talk about. You know, when we see these big, you know, anti-zoological spokespeople, or just even your average, you know, anti-zoological keyboard activist, you know, they tend to really fixate on certain things, you know, be it, you know, a whale or the cetaceans or an elephant, but what do you think? Do you think the end goal of the zoological movement is going to stop with those larger species, or do you think that there is some other end goal to these people that are so vocally against these institutions?
Well, I think you just have to look at some of the writings of the founders of these organizations to see that they're not going to stop at orcas and elephants and chimps and tigers and so forth. They're going to keep going, up to and including taking away your right to have a cat or a dog in your home. Mm-hmm. It sounds extreme. It sounds, no way, no, that can't happen. But there are efforts afoot to limit your ability to exercise your freedoms here in the United States and elsewhere. And so I do take those organizations seriously, in part because they're extremely well funded. Yeah. I think every conservation scientist at every zoo would you know, drool over the budget of HSUS or PETA. Money that they spend simply smearing others and hiring lawyers and lobbyists to change the very laws that we're talking about. Now, I have to say this, they're getting really smart. They know that they probably can't open up the Endangered Species Act anytime soon, but they can work county by county, state by state to change laws that few people are paying attention to, because it's bit by bit by bit by bit. And over the span, and they're extremely patient, so over the span of 20, 30, 40 years, the landscape's going to look very different if organizations like Awesome Ocean and those of us who work in zoos and aquariums don't wake up and speak up and promote the great things that zoos are doing.
So one thing that we want, Megan just asked, for instance, kind of following this line of thinking, is how do you think zoos can spread their message to a wider audience, you know, fighting negative press and animal rights extremists?
I don't think zoos should get in the business of trying to go head-to-head with these organizations, and certainly we shouldn't adopt the same tactics. Mm-hmm. But I do think it's important. To immediately, when you're in an interview, when a guest says, well, you know, orcas live half the life of blah, 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 whatever the falsehood is that's been spread, you stop them at that moment politely and say, that's not true.
Certainly.
Here's what's been published. Here's what we know to be true. So you don't acknowledge or accept the premise, especially when the premise is so off base and based on false information. And then you politely redirect people and re-educate them into what we do know, what we do find in peer-reviewed science. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, we have to continue to get better. And one of the things I love about zoos and aquariums is we aren't perfect, but you know what? It's a rare industry and endeavor to find people who are so dedicated to say, you know what, that was okay yesterday or last year, but we want to do better next year. And for me, that is all the proof you need that an organization is on the right track, and that is they're always trying to get better. I'm an imperfect zookeeper, I'm an imperfect human being, but you know what? I try to do things better than I did last time, and that to me is the hallmark of a great zoo.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of the news of the day, which is what's going on with Lolita and her being classified under the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of activists are taking this as some sort of victory, you know, that she's been listed. But, you know, coming through the notes for the ruling, you know, like anything is going to change for her. So why are they claiming this as a victory, or is it a victory, or can you maybe bring this down a level to people who might not understand what this really means for Lolita or for any animal?
Well, for those of you who are interested in, I would strongly suggest you read my recent column, which was posted on Awesome Ocean, because I think it addresses parts of this. But isn't that really
I love it.
Well, we like
was
it.
just shameless. That was just terribly shameless of me, and I apologize. No, I don't.
Good for all three.
The situation with Lolita is just one of those. One of the reasons that I can just do what I do publicly is that just I look at things and I'm just incredulous by some of the statements and some of the actions that are taking place by our opponents. Because, and this is a great example, Lolita has lived in human care for 44, 45 years. When I saw her probably about 10 or 12 years ago or more, she was the best looking killer whale I'd ever seen, and she was an older whale at that time. I mean, she was a beautiful animal. Clearly, something has been working right if she's been able to live that long in that facility. Her needs are being met. Now, I understand the passion on both sides, but as far as what the ruling changed, I don't even think the NOAA Fisheries understands what the ruling will mean in the future. They've said, I read a report that they're going to open up hearings as far as, because there will be petitions from people who want to release her. They're going to want to do a, Keiko 2.0, I suppose, and try to release her back in the wild. And that was such a tragic situation for Keiko. So hopefully, now the good news is this, and all joking aside, the good news is the opponents seem to have learned something from Keiko's very tragic end, and that is everyone's talking about putting her in a sea pen. The problem is they want to put her in a sea pen in some of the most toxic water along the United States coastlines with some of the most toxic fish that we know about. And the reason we know about it is because, of course, the southern resident population has been well studied for the past several decades. So that is not a healthy population, and there's a reason for it. It's because their environments are not all that healthy to begin with. So I would venture a guess that the service would be very hesitant to try to reintroduce her to the wild. But lately, I have no idea where they'll go with it, and obviously there's going to be a public comment period. But to your earlier question, why focus on an animal like Lolita? It's very simple. It means money. It's money for these organizations. It's a rallying call. It's a way for them to get funding from their unsuspecting donors, and it's a victory, as you say, from their point of view, and it just feeds their money machine. And that let's not kid ourselves. These organizations are about raising big bucks. Money that could go towards conservation isn't going to conservation. It's going to fending off lawsuits from these very well-funded organizations.
So basically, I mean, that's a pretty good way to sum it all up, right? I mean, not only are they taking money from donors, and these donors think they're helping animals, but really they're contributing to these kind of, these almost semantic changes, like this. I mean, how much money did it cost for them to appeal this many times? And then you look, those donors could have been giving money to organizations that are actively out doing conservation work, but they're not. Instead, they're helping these organizations, fund these bizarre, misguided things that are, looking to put this killer whale out in this toxic water.
You're right, and you're right, Erin. And the higher listing for Lolita means that she now is subject to much more stringent protections under the Endangered Species Act. On the surface, that sounds like a really good thing, right? In the wild, we want greater protections for wild populations of animals. What this really will mean for the Miami Aquarium, I think, is that they're going to face lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit because, oh my gosh, someone sneezed next to Lolita, you've harassed her, you've harmed her, you whatever, and you violated the Endangered Species Act. I think that's the kind of situation we're headed for because of this new ruling. And it's going to be nonsensical. You watch. Strap yourselves in because it's going to be a circus.
Yeah. No, I think you've hit on a lot. One of the things that I think has frustrated me is, as Erin and I and other people who have embarked on this journey, with Awesome Ocean, as we've engaged with a lot of people, I know one of the most simplistic things that I've heard that really frustrated me that kind of sums up a lot of times misguided good intentions. Like one time we were having a Twitter discussion with this young lady, and her response to when I said, what are we going to do about, like, like habitat pressures and stuff like that, and her response was just expand the forest. And I think that there is a communication breakdown on what people believe the wild to be. Just like, like the toxic waters, off the coast, boat strikings with whales, the noise issues with whales, the effect of whale watching on wild whale populations. And I feel like a lot of times the information that we're dealing with is at a higher scientific level,
Right.
And so how can we better disseminate? How can the average SeaWorld fan or zoo fan, people who've really gone into this and really kind of dove in head first and really kind of learned all about the zoos and their benefits, how can we break it down? What have you seen, I guess, at your facility, or in your personal life? How have you been able to break down some of these major communication issues? To communicate better.
I'd love to say that we have, but we haven't. In my case, I'm very fortunate to work at an institution where we work weekly with our local and regional news media, and so a lot of the segments are about, look at this new animal, look at this new exhibit or whatever. But occasionally we can talk about some of those more serious issues, like the fact that hundreds of thousands of marine mammals are killed in boat strikes.
Yeah.
And to the person you referenced earlier, I would say, we need to add more forest or whatever. Well, okay, are you prepared to give up your iPad for that?
Yeah.
Are you prepared to drive a car for another 5 or 10 years and not buy a new car, so we don't have to ship a new car from Japan or Korea over the ocean and run the risk of killing a whale or two just to deliver you your new products? And that, I think, is the future of conservation. And that is, we need our consumers, all 7.1 billion of us, on our side in terms of conservation.
So
it's easy to talk about conservation in the abstract. Oh, I cut the rings out of my my can holders so that no one gets their head caught in it, and I recycle my plastic. That's great. That's awesome. And if that's all you can do, good for you. But let's think about this realistically. We are using up resources. We have an entire world economy. We have civilization. We have an economy. And we need conservation. The crossroads of those three things have got to be solved. And so far, we aren't solving them. And it's going to require zoo folks, zoo opponents, governments, nonprofits, for-profits to work together. And I think the more we're frank about that with our general public, however big the audience is, whether it's online like this or over the internet or in person at a zoo, the more we have those real conversations, the more we have hope that we can make a difference.
Well, and I think, when we are talking about the zoo opponents, like we said, they're perpetrating this dangerous myth that supporting their activities is supporting conservation. And so, when we talk about what zoos are doing, and they're trying to find these, intersections, and I know there's some zoological organizations that are working locally to try to find those interfaces, like where consumers and conservation can overlap. So it's sort of like this larger, like the big picture versus the little picture, when zoos are trying to examine conservation as a whole, and their opponents are trying to nitpick at issues that don't apply to that larger picture or that are, negatable.
That's really well said, and I think there's some great zoos out there that work locally with their students and teach. It's teaching that ethic. It's teaching young people and our visitors, hey, let's be mindful of the impact that our actions and our purchases have on our world, including that species that you're looking at right now across the way at our zoo or aquarium. That's a really important thing. I think being able to tie, human action into the animals that wowed them today at the zoo and aquarium, that's the challenge. And it's not an easy solution. And you're right, there are some local efforts that can happen, but the second most powerful force on the planet is an educated consumer. Unfortunately, the most powerful force on the planet is an uneducated consumer. And we're going to have 9 billion of them in about 30 years.
It's kind of terrifying. So one thing I'm going to make an outrageous comparison, but I don't think it's that outrageous when I say it out loud. So we'll see. Now, one thing, we've had this reexamination of this anti-vaccine debate that's come up, where we've looked at people who've rejected science, who've rejected authority, who've rejected sound reason, and they put the general populace at risk, when the vast majority of the population believes in the science behind vaccination, believes in the science, and vaccinates their children. Over the past few weeks, I feel like I've seen a lot of similarities between the insanely vocal minority of people who believe that zoos have no benefit, and I feel like it's ruining conservation for the world, versus the vast majority of people, because I believe zoos in North America get about 100 million visitors a year. And so when you think about it, like, that's mainstream. Going to a zoo is mainstream. The general population likes zoos. And so, do you feel like it is an insane vocal minority that can potentially ruin global conservation?
I think they certainly can wield influence, and you know how things can be. In fact, just earlier today, I was watching a committee hearing from Washington State considering a bill to ban cetaceans in educational and entertainment facilities, which, by the way, Washington State currently doesn't have any marine mammals in those situations. It's kind of a proactive move. Yeah. So I do think it's important for those of us, those 85% of us in the middle, who are reasonable and get our kids vaccinated, et cetera, that mindset, that we pay attention to these things, because if we don't, you hear this all the time during voting season. In fact, when there's low voter turnout, low participation in the democratic process, then things change, and suddenly we're like, oh, how did that happen? Well, it's because we weren't paying attention, we weren't being involved. And a few years ago, I wrote an email to a training listserv at one of the zoo associations, and I basically kind of encourage people to say, hey, speak up about the training programs at your zoo. If you're doing something cool, if you're drawing blood voluntarily on a tiger, then tell your guests about it and tell them why that's important. Because you don't have to use anesthetic just to get a simple vaccination to your cat or whatever. And because that's really cool, and be more vocal about what you're doing, and don't take for granted that your public is always going to support you, because as we've seen over the last 5 years, the public won't always support you, because there are people shouting in their ears and through their Twitter accounts that zoos and aquariums are bad. Well, they're not all bad. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some bad players, and that's why we have government oversight to shut those places down. And that's also why we have zoo associations that establish the highest standards that we know of today. Those standards are always trying to elevate and improve as our understanding improves. So I think having an educated consumer and teaching them the difference between a zoo that maybe should be shut down and zoos that are really trying to get better with each and every year, that's where we can help consumers make better choices. And to me, it's important that we all speak up and celebrate what we do. Zoos matter. Zoos absolutely matter.
Certainly.
We agree. 100%.
All right, let's see here. We actually have some questions from the chat room. Ted wants to know, does a Washington State cetacean ban, wouldn't that throw a wrench into the works for the Lolita activists?
Interesting question. That's, I can imagine it would, because I think there's some exceptions in the bill, and I don't know where the committee meeting, how the conversation went. I had to tune out, but I guess we'll find out. But my understanding of that bill is that there's an exemption for like stranding animals and rescue and rehabilitation for the purpose of reintroducing them back in the wild. But from all I can tell, there's no plans for something like that, even amongst the most ardent supporters of Lolita, to get her out of the aquarium. I don't think anyone's really seriously talking about putting her back in the wild alone, unequipped to deal with living in the wild. So you're right. That's a fascinating development. So we'll have to stay tuned to that. It's been an amazing week this week. It's really, there have been several major zoo-related, aquarium, oceanarium-related events this week, including the Washington State.
So
Yeah.
going in what you're talking about, kind of the tiger blood draw and working with animals directly, obviously over your tenure, you've seen the widespread implementation of positive reinforcement. You are an expert on positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
And so from your experience, how has that changed the inner working zoo experience as you've seen positive reinforcement become widely adopted throughout the industry?
I love that question, and here's why. When I started at SeaWorld of Ohio, at that time, most zoos were run by biologists, either veterinarians or biology majors. And the behaviorists, the trainers, the people you see interacting with animals and teaching these great husbandry behaviors, they kind of had they got to sit at the kids' table during Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons I left SeaWorld and to go to graduate school was I wanted to get trained in the biological sciences. I'm actually trained as a physiologist. Mm-hmm. And the reason I did that is I fully intended to go back into a zoo setting when I was done with my doctoral work, because I wanted to marry the behavioral and the biological disciplines into something that everyone could communicate with each other and to elevate the importance of behavioral management. Mm-hmm. Well, the good news is, turns out I didn't have to go to grad school to do that, because a lot of zoos have caught fire on that concept, and now you have behavioral curators, you have behavioral managers, behavioral supervisors, trainers, and keepers all over North America and all over the world have recognized the value of operant conditioning with positive reinforcement to teach voluntary blood draws. We don't have to stress an animal out or dart it and run the risk of chemical immobilization simply to do an annual exam on a cat. And that has conservation value, because now that endangered Sumatran tiger we're not risking its life by anesthetizing it. We can ask it to hop on a scale and weigh it once a day or once a week. We can draw blood from its tail and see that it's doing okay, or if it's ovulating, etc. So while I was off doing graduate school, the entire zoo profession continued its progress, this evolution towards incorporating more sciences, and it's been great to see. It's continuing. It is the future, and that's why we need to support institutions, particularly those that use positive reinforcement to help manage and maintain and train their animals for these purposes.
So it sounds like sort of over the course of your career, positive reinforcement has become basically like the front lines of animal care. But a lot of people really don't understand how positive reinforcement works. And in your experience, is there a need to use anything besides very positive training techniques? Is there ever a need to use animal deprivation, or can you take full care of the animal using only those positive operant methods?
Under normal conditions, if I'm just trying to teach an animal to hop on a scale or touch my target, my hand, or to show me a flipper or trunk or whatever, under normal conditions, no, you don't need to use any sort of aversive type training. There are times, though, for the health and well-being of the animal or the safety of the staff, where you might have to use an aversive. You might have to say no, or you might have to restrain an animal to get that blood or to knock them down chemically because they're sick, they're injured, they're ill, whatever.
Certainly.
And so, you can always go back and repair any relationship or behavioral deficits you might create, because there's a crisis and you've got to intervene. If you've got a dystocia in an animal that's going to die and her calf's going to die because you don't intervene, because we don't want to be aversive, well, that's foolish.
Right.
You'd have to. That's why we have veterinary medicine. That's why we do have chemical restraint and so forth.
Certainly.
So animal management is a whole spectrum of working with those animals. But even in an exhibit or species that gets very little hands-on care or very little need to interact with them on a daily basis, you can use operant conditioning to improve their welfare, to improve keeper safety, and to encourage those animals to engage in cooperative behaviors, even if it's just, hey, come a little closer so we can take a look at you. Come a little closer so we can, collect some urine. Come a little closer because we don't want you to be afraid the next time we actually do have to dart you and move you, or et cetera. So,
Yeah.
or treat you because there's an emergency. So I wouldn't say that there's never ever a need to restrain an animal like that, but it's
Right.
usually a medical situation and an emergency situation.
Emergency.
And the great thing about behavior is it's very, very plastic. It's pliable. So even if it sets you back for a few days, you can go back and repair that with a lot more positive reinforcement.
Certainly. And on top of that, you know, there has been this recent story that broke on the dodo of this trainer overseas who was filmed, you know, striking an animal. And so in your professional experience, is there ever a reason or a situation where you know, I think you've seen the video, you know, is there ever a scenario where you think you would, you know, where that's excusable, I guess, or no?
Again, hopefully people don't parse my words to use it against me, but no, I don't believe there is a time to do that, with one exception. If you're in a free contact situation or even a protected contact situation that's gone awry and your life is at stake, or let's say you're walking your dog on a leash and you're with your child in a stroller and a feral dog or a neighbor's dog comes by and threatens to attack you. In that situation, I think you have to do whatever you have to protect yourself and to get out of harm's way. The good news is, working with positive reinforcement day in and day out, things rarely get to that kind of level of frustration or aggressive potential. So what we see in the video, and again, I'm not a big fan of the dodo. It's clear their anti-zoo bias is in every piece
Very
they
clear.
do.
Yep.
And the video, but having said that, the video is disgusting. It has no place in modern training. It has no place in a modern zoo and aquarium. If those folks worked for me, they'd be fired on the spot. And I know that IMATA and other marine mammal organizations are looking into the matter, investigating who's involved, and are going to come out strong condemning this kind of action for a variety of reasons. Number one, if your reasoning for using an aversive or punishment or a punitive measure, like you see in that video, is because the animal's not working fast enough for you, they're not on your schedule, well, then your priorities are screwed up anyway. Because as you mentioned, I wrote a book called Zoomility. Working with animals is a privilege. Training animals is a humbling experience. And it is all about putting your ego aside, taking your watches off, and working on what your animal's schedule is and what their needs are, not on what your ego is demanding in the moment. And so when I see trainers react that way out of frustration because an animal is confused because maybe they're not really good trainers to begin with, that pisses me off. And I know it pisses off 99.9% of the folks that I'm friends with and peers with in IMATA and elsewhere. And it has no place in zoos, and I strongly condemn what we see in that video, particularly because it's simply to train a voluntary behavior for an educational demonstration or husbandry behavior. It has no place in that situation. No place whatsoever.
All right. We are now... We're now going to move on to a little bit happier topics as we wrap up a little bit, and we kind of do some final questions. So Carolyn wants to know what your favorite celebrity advocate is.
My favorite celebrity advocate, all joking aside, it's my good friend Carolyn Hennessy. And if you haven't read her books, she wrote the Pandora series for tween-age boys and girls. If you don't watch her on General Hospital or Jessie or Revenge or any number of other things she's involved in, she's one of the hardest working actresses in LA. She's an author. And I approached her a number of years ago about a very difficult subject. The circus was coming to town. And I presented to her an alternative point of view about elephants at this particular organization. Not in favor of the organization, but just simply point out that, the world is neither black nor white. The world is actually gray. It truly is. And sometimes the biggest evil villains also have some redeeming qualities. And in this case, there was some redeeming qualities. And that began a conversation with Carolyn. And I'm proud to say she is just a wonderful lady. She's passionate. And unlike most celebrities that get involved in animal-related issues, Carolyn does her homework. I mean, she spent on her own dime. She went to Southeast Asia to see how elephants are being cared for there. Yeah. On her own dime, she's gone to Florida to investigate some of the great elephant programs in this country at Busch Gardens, Tampa. And she has even started on her own dime and produced her own radio show, which folks can check out on UBN Radio every other Sunday night. It's called Animal Magnetism, and there's some fascinating animal people on there. It's very similar to the kind of thing that you're doing here at Awesome Ocean. In fact, you two need to hook up with Carolyn and talk amongst yourselves, because I think you would accomplish some of the goals that you mentioned earlier in the interview about getting the word out and kind of pushing back on all the negativity, while still holding zoos and aquariums accountable for doing things like we should be doing it, and not what we saw in that dodo video earlier this week.
All right. A few more questions here. Okay, so Robert wants to know, what classes would you recommend for a high school to a college student who wants to get involved in conservation rehab and the zoo safari park goals that you have?
You know, that's a great question. It's one we get often. I would say, first of all, stay in school, get an education. I don't care if you get a degree in basket weaving, but showing that determination and the ability to complete a project and invest in yourself is so important. But while you're doing that, go out and shovel some stalls at your local shelter or horse facility. Go volunteer at a vet clinic. Get yourself dirty and make sure it's something you want to do. I've met plenty of keepers who are incredibly well educated. They got 2- or 4-year degrees or more, and they think, my goodness, I want to work with animals. I want to save the world. They spend 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars on their degrees, and they get into it, and suddenly, oh, I stink when I go home. Ew, I don't make a ton of money. This is not what I thought it should be. And they go away frustrated and sad because what they thought they wanted is not really what they were cut out for. So do yourself a favor and go run around in the mud and turn over those rocks and look for those crayfish to see if it's really for you, and then go with God and have fun at it.
And then, without going down a complete rabbit hole, this person asks, what are your thoughts on killing Keiko? Because this is a whole different tangent.
We'll have to come back and bring Mark Simmons in for that one. Killing, it's interesting because I actually was asked by Ocean Futures to review that release protocol while that project was ongoing and while Ocean Futures had a prominent role. In fact, I had the option of going to Iceland and joining Mark's team of trainers, or come here to Arizona and work where I work today. And so I'm kind of connected to the story in the sense that I knew about the release protocol. And what I would say is, had they actually followed the protocol, Keiko might still be alive today. And so if you haven't read Killing Keiko, I urge you to go pick it up, because whether you're pro-zoo, anti-zoo, whether you're for releasing Lolita or not, it's a compelling story. Mark is a fabulous writer. And if you're interested in behavior, I was amazed at some of the behavioral terminology and things he was able to weave in without even making it look like a textbook at all. It wasn't. It was fascinating. It'll piss you off. It'll make you cry. It will make you cheer. And at the end, it's going to make you very sad and probably angry at a few organizations. So definitely pick it up and take a look at it.
All right, there's a few more fan questions, and then we have some wrap-up questions here.
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. Oh my gosh, there are so many questions here. Everyone's asking. You're very popular here, Gray.
I've been talking too long. I'm sorry.
We should do like another hour after this.
Okay, so Lodi asks, many zoos and aquariums are unable to expand habitat size due to financial or legal restrictions. How do you address people who find that more important than the indirect positive impact of zoos?
You know, that's a really interesting observation. A lot of zoos have lost habitat within their own borders because there's competing issues, because they got to raise revenue. They need sources of income like special events, or they want to build classrooms so they can have parties on the weekends for weddings to generate revenue so that they can have classrooms during the week for school kids. These are really tough economic conditions. And one of the things I challenge my zoo and aquarium colleagues to be more like is we have to be more entrepreneurial. Being entrepreneurial is not a 4-letter word if you're a nonprofit organization. You have to find ways to generate revenue without sacrificing your code of ethics and sacrificing animal welfare or presenting the animals in a non-respectful way. But we have to be more entrepreneurial because, as we've seen, zoos are increasingly faced with all kinds of competition for those dollars. And a real effect of that has been, over the last 10 years, large hoofed animals, like the Arabian oryx we talked about earlier. There are fewer of them in human care in zoos today than there were 10 years ago. That's not a good trend. And it goes to show that even though we solve a conservation crisis for a species today, it's no guarantee that we've saved the Arabian oryx in perpetuity, because there are competing pressures, like we need to build a special events tent, and we need that pasture more for that tent so we can raise money and hire more keepers or build more enrichment devices, which means we've got to farm out the Arabian oryx to some other situation, or we have to manage them to extinction in human care. So these are real issues, serious issues, one that zoos should be focused on, not silly things like the bill in Washington State today.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it really sort of addresses all these different facilities and whatever their economic challenges, making sure their priorities are in line and you're not, you're keeping that revenue and not compromising everything else. So I think that's really important for us to think about. Yeah, I know, it's
very tough.
Not great. Well, we have one last question before we wrap up here, and in your book, Zoomility, you talk a lot about taking positive reinforcement experiences from the zoo setting into the home setting. So what would be one tip that you'd want to give to someone who wants to, try out some positive operant conditioning with their dog or their cat?
Thank you for asking that question. I love that. What I would say to people is, for the 2 seconds a day that your animal really ticks you off because they're barking or they're whining or they're scratching at your door, think about focusing on them the other 23.5 hours a day when they're doing exactly what you want, which is they're sleeping, they're watching TV, they're playing with their toys quietly, they're not chewing on your child, they're not eating your leather purse. Focus your attention 5 seconds earlier than when you would normally react to them because you're pissed, and you will have a better, more successful pet, and you'll teach them to live with you and what it's like in your world, in your own home. It's all about rewarding what you want and ignoring what you don't.
Those are the good suggestions. That's pretty.
Words of wisdom.
Yeah.
Probably work on your child.
So,
but it was.
Tim Morrow says that he uses LSRs on his wife.
Oh, you're in trouble now, buddy.
I just outed Tim. All right. So as we begin to wrap up today, we want to thank everyone for engaging in the chat room. Everyone remained very civil, asked some very great questions,
yes,
and some really good engagement going on there. And we really want to take a moment to thank Dr. Grace Stafford again for joining us for this Q&A. We want to thank everyone for participating. And we also want to personally recommend that you check out Dr. Stafford's book on positive reinforcement, Zoomility, A Keeper's Tale of Training with Positive Reinforcement. And also, please follow him on Twitter. He actually has a really great Twitter account. It's very inspiring, too, actually. I look forward to a lot of his tweets that he does because they always pick me up. It's at Zoomility, so ZOOMILITY. Also, follow us on Awesome Motion, and that's at One Awesome Motion. We will be doing another Q&A in 2 weeks. We don't have that quite squared away yet, but once we do, we'll go ahead and share it again. But we want to thank you for being a part of this Q&A. Thank you again, Dr. Stafford. I really appreciate your time with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Do you have any parting words for these aspiring zookeepers and trainers out there?
I do. I would just say keep supporting Awesome Ocean, because this is exactly the kind of voice that zookeepers need and want to respectfully push back against the nonsense and to promote all the great things that zoos are doing and still call out those that aren't quite up to speed yet. So thank you for what you guys have done in the last year and for giving us all a voice to celebrate what we do.
Well, it's definitely our pleasure.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Anything you guys need, we're on.
All right, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and keep on being awesome.